So application development, lecture 1 will focus on overview of programming, logic and design. And this is agenda for today's presentation. We will understand the structure of application, okay, web application. We will also try to understand the programming process. One process, analysis and design. Okay, that's takes into account broader perspective. But in this course, we will just focus on programming process. Where now you are going to program something. You got analysis and design, you created your class diagram or whatever. Now you are going to program it. So we will take a narrow focus in this course. But again, it comes under the overall analysis and design picture. And in this, we will discuss about pseudocode, flowcharts, and when we are doing implementation, what is the role of data types, variables, session variables, and so on. And then at the end, we look at evolution of programming techniques. Especially, I will try to differentiate between procedural programming and object-oriented programming. Okay, so we all know how computers work. To computers, we provide some input, they process that input, and then they give us output, and they may save this information on the secondary storage device as well. Okay, this is what we do, processing information so that we can benefit from them. And the operating system we use is a system software, okay, that we install on these machines to make use of hardware. Now, web applications are application software. So in computers, the objective of computer is process information, compute it, irrespective what is the nature of information. Whereas in application software, our focus is to address certain scenario. We want to achieve certain business objectives. And in application software, we have certain objectives to achieve, and in order to achieve those objectives, we build a logic. We program that logic so that input can be given to that web application, that input can get processed, and output can be generated. Okay, so you can see that web application focus is very much on achieving certain objectives that may business want in their current domain. But overall functionalities, or you can say the things which we are doing with the computers, giving them input, output, processing the information, same thing is happening over here. So this is computer, business computer for that company. It will involve storage and retrieval information as well as we do have in computer systems. So input to a web application can be given by user, and normally we do it. We type in. Or there is another application that provide input to some application. Can you think of scenario where one application is providing information to another application? Oh, hurry up. Weather applications providing information to? Telephones, yeah. Online payment. You submit your credit card information. Application basically give you information through banking application. Banking application verified and give back to your application, and your application give back, send back results to you. So application to application. Or it may be a database. When you open a form, web page is reading for the database, pulling all the information and display it to you. So input can be in various fashion. And once input is available to a web application, then we need to organize it, we need to process it, we need to check the accuracy and validity of the information, whether the commands are legitimate, the data is legitimate or not, and do some processing, calculate how much the revenues have been generated for this company, and display it. Okay, and the information is displayed normally on the browser as the output, or it maybe gets saved in the database. Okay, now over here, basically, it depicts this figure depicts architecture of web application. So how many of you know about web server and application server? The difference between them, web server and application server. Have you heard of these terms before? Okay, let me explain to you. So browser we all know. Okay, browser is through which we type in and submit our request. Our request basically goes to web server. So web server is a software that listens on certain ports, and it receives all the requests. So this is software that receives the request for certain web pages, and it look at the extension of the web page that is being requested, whether it is HTML or is it ASPX, which is .NET, ASP.NET, or it's PHP. So web server task is just to receive the request and try to identify what is this page. Is it PHP page? Is it HTML page? Or it's ASPX page? Is it, if it is HTML page, then within the web server directory, we will have that web page located over there, and that web page contents would be read by web server, and they will be returned back to the browser, and user can see them. But if the extension is PHP or ASPX, then what will happen? Web server does not know these languages. The task of web server is just receive the request, and if it is HTML, process it. Otherwise, it will forward that request to specific application server. Now, application server for ASP would be different, and for PHP would be different. So these are the compilers you can think of that language. So if it is PHP, a request will be forwarded to PHP application server. PHP application server will read all the code, execute the code, build up HTML, and give it back to browser. And when browser receive HTML, it can give back to the user. If it's similar, if it is ASPX application server will get start execution of the web page and give back result to web server, and web server give result back to the user. And if we have to save that information or read information, then this application server basically running the code which is PHP or ASP, and we all know using these programming languages we can connect to the database, we can read information, we can write information. Okay, so you can see that the architecture of web application is distributed in nature. Okay, it's distributed in nature. Now, these components 1, 2, 3, 4, they can be distributed as well. Maybe web server is running on one machine, application server is running on another machine, and database is on some other machine. It's quite possible, or they can be on one machine as well. Okay, so it's all about configuration, how to configure them. And secondly, sometime web server has plugged in application server as well. So when you install web server, it has application servers as well in them. Especially in workshop, we will install XAMPP, which is web server, but it has PHP application server as well. Okay, so this is the architecture of a typical web application. Okay. So any question about application server, web server? Now you know the difference.
So application server is just like the interface. When someone puts say something in from the browser, it interfaces it to like the database. The application server is like the compiler.
Yeah, it's an interface for a database. We call HTML cannot access. For example, you want to access a database, HTML cannot access the database. So you need a programming language, for example, ASP.NET using C# that provides you a set of classes to interact with the database. Okay, so whenever there is a programming code involved, application server will get activated. For example, there is a command connect to the database server that will get executed, and connection will be established with the database. And there is a command execute this query, which is select query from customer. Then it will get executed on the database server, on the database, and then result will be returned to application server. When all programming code get executed, the output will be given to web server, which will be HTML. Okay, so now we are talking about input given to the applications and processing of information. Now, in order to process information, as we know in computers, what we do? We load the information in a RAM from hard disk. So, and in hard disk, in RAM, we are holding the information. Now, in this web application, we need some containers to hold this information, and those containers are variable. Okay, I'm sure you have done some programming. Is there anyone who haven't done any programming course at all? So that's good. We know what are variables, what are constants. Why we have constant if we have variables?
Because they take up as memory or store.
No, because in program variables value can get updated. Okay, but if we want that there is a certain value which we don't want any instruction to update the variable, we can make that variable as a constant. Okay, I think I have one example in the upcoming slides. So again, session variable. Anybody heard of session variable? Okay. So do you know when you log in into some website, then you don't need to log in again? Cookie is one way to solve it. So whenever you log into some website, for example, every website, if there are certain personalized contents or maybe some confidential information, you need to log in. But you log in only one page. After that, the next pages, they does not ask you for login. So behind the scenes, session variables are working. We will see what session variables are. It's like a visitor is coming to an organization and he has been given a visitor card. Now he can go to any lecture hall and he can attend the lecture. But if he does not have that visitor card, then he cannot access any building. So session variables you can think of as a visitor card. So these variables help programming languages to define variables and hold values in those variables. So these are internal storage within the program. And we also need sometimes external storage. We need to dump some information, and we can use text files, log files is one of the examples. Sometimes we need to share information with some another web application. Then we use XML. I hope you know the difference between simple text file and XML. Can someone point out what's the difference? A simple text file, what's the difference between simple text file and XML? Extensible markup language.
XML is still like a language. It's still like
XML has some structure.
yeah.
It has a structure. CSV file does not have any structure. You just dump the information, first name, last name, separated by comma or forward slash or whatever. In XML, you use tags like HTML. So there is structure involved. So that structured information can be shared with another application. Or you can store it in relational database management systems. And I hope you have taken a relationship database management course, some database management. Okay. So in order to define those variables, we have programming languages, and especially in case of web scenario, we have ASP.NET, and ASP.NET is basically a programming environment in which you can use different languages. You can use VB.NET, you can C#.NET. Okay. And again, in second phase of this unit, we will discuss about how is it possible that there are 24 or 25 languages supported in Visual Studio. Okay. That you can use for programming, and how is that possible, and how they manage all this, PHP, Java, and so on. Now we all know that these programming languages follow certain rules, which we call syntactical rules. Okay, if you follow those rules, your program will run. The application server will be able to process your code. Excuse me. And when we are able to write that code, application server basically converts that code to machine language. Okay, it basically read the instructions, convert them into machine language, and then that's why operating system and the hardware is able to execute them. So there are two ways this programming, high-level programming language code can be converted into machine code. One is compiler, and second is interpreter. So what's the difference?
I thought you were asking what is a
Yeah.
compiler.
No, I'm going to ask now. Yeah, what's the difference?
Well, compiler compiles your program into a single application that goes straight to the CPU and runs instructions.
Okay, and what's the interpreter?
The interpreter processes one instruction at a time.
Okay, yeah. Anyone else want to add something to it? How many of you hearing this term first time? How many of you hearing this first time? Only a couple of students. Okay. So compiler basically, do you know the example of compiler languages?
C++, Visual Basic.
Yeah, and Java is again, if you have done Java programming, you compile the class and you compile the Java class, so Java code, and you get a class file, and that class file is basically compiled form, and you can move it anywhere. Okay, so compiler basically go through all the file, compile it, convert it to machine code, and then that can get executed. For example, it compile everything, convert it to machine code, and then basically it get executed. Whereas interpreter do this thing on fly. And if you can look over here, in case of compilation, the source code is basically converted into executable code first, and then its execution will started. Whereas in interpreter, it's on the fly. It will read one line, it will execute it, and it may get displayed on the browser as well. Okay? So this is the difference. PHP is interpreter based language. Okay, whereas C#, ASP.NET using C#, VB.NET, they are compiled languages. Okay, so this is the difference between these two. So when we are programming or logic, then we have to be careful about few things. One thing is syntactical error, and compilers or interpreters helps you to identify those errors. In C++, if there's error, there's no bracket, you try to compile the program, you get an error. In Python, all the languages, That's why, because those application servers, compilers, they basically follow certain rules. According to those rules, they check your program. If your program does not follow those rules, they will point out an error. Okay. But logical errors are difficult to identify. Logical errors are the errors that is something wrong with your logic. And if you look at this example, you can easily point out what's wrong over here. Okay. Will you get finally the cake? Very less likely. So logic is something which developer is responsible for. That's why we have testers. Why we have testing? Testing is not for syntactical errors. Testers, the test cases are built for to understand and get identify these logical errors. So what is the logic error over here? Can you spot it? Yeah, but brackets are not there, because these mathematical operations, they follow certain rules, and compiler does not those rules. What do you want to implement? So this is programmer's responsibility to be care of these logical errors. So logical errors, semantical errors are very difficult to identify, and if you're not able to correct them while you're programming, then it's very hard to go back. And especially if you leave the organization and someone else come and you haven't done any documentation, then it's become nightmare. The new programmer, new developer, in order to rectify that problem, he introduced more problems into the system, which is very classic case people try to address. So most of the time in large applications, because logic is very complex, different people have contributed to development of those applications. So logical errors are more prevalent in large applications. So that's why we need to follow certain structure. Okay, if you look over here, it's very much important that we know we need to take some input, and then we need to process that input by looking at its legitimacy, the format, and all the stuff which we need to do, and then we basically can make use of that information. So this is one of the basic logical flow we need to follow. Okay, and within that processing, we take into account brackets and whatever the rules that need to be applied. So programming languages help us to hold the information in the form of variables, constants, session variables, and we are careful while writing the programming or logic that it should be syntactical free, it should be semantical error free. Now, there are certain rules that governs the business, and those rules need to be codified in your logic so that they can act on this data. So this is the processing part, and we need to, so when we are building application, we need to codify all those rules so that application eventually will give the advantage which the business is trying to achieve, so that those rules can act on the data and can produce some useful output. For example, revenue spreadsheet, the number of orders has been placed. And this is where things become very critical, especially if you are developing it for big organization. Now converting all those rules into your application is a major task. That's why rule-based systems have been introduced, in which focuses only on rules and you don't bother about rest of the things. Okay. So if you have done analysis of the use cases you identify and the business rules you have identified that cover each and everything, then it's okay. But if you miss something, then definitely rectifying them is a big challenge. And once you build an application and release it and go to production, then making correction is very challenging. Why is it so? How many of you have taken software engineering course? None of you? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I see. Almost most of you. So why it's challenging to maintain an application? Because application is running, and if something needs to modify, it has to first of all go through a certain channel. Okay, so it will take time. And then when you are modifying that information, again, if it's a new developer and there's no proper documentation, that person may introduce more errors, as I mentioned previously. So in this case, that's why it's very important that you fix these things while you are building your logic. You need to brainstorm each and every scenario. What is possible over here? These are the 5 things user can do. But if something happens other than this, does my code cater for that? if you heard of exceptional handling, we will there's in second part of the unit we talk about exceptions. If there will be some exception in this scenario, does my logic cater for that exception or not? So you need to basically take these things into account as well in order to avoid these problems later on. So this was about application component. Now we are going to understand the programming process. I think you can take 10 minutes break. It's 10 past 11 and we will start again 20 past 11.
What a great comment.
Hmm?
What a great comment.
Yeah. Because I want to finish this in one go. Okay.